Grandpa doesn't really count as family anymore, does he? I mean, he's not even married to Grandma. He's just, like, the old guy who shows up sometimes. My 13-year-old grandson Tyler said it to his sister, at my own kitchen table, over a bowl of cereal, not realizing I was standing in the hallway close enough to hear every word. His sister Madison, 15, laughed and agreed. The particular careless laugh of teenagers who haven't yet learned that words said quietly still land exactly as hard as words said loudly. 6 weeks later, a lawyer's letter arrived at their mother's house explaining exactly how much, not really counting as family, was about to cost them, and exactly how much it would have cost them not to. My name is Walter Grimsby. I'm 74 years old, divorced from my first wife Carol 31 years ago, and for the past 19 years, the second husband of a woman named Patricia, whose 2 daughters from her first marriage each had children of their own, my step-grandchildren, Tyler and Madison among them, for grandchildren total across 2 households, though only 2 of them live close enough to see regularly. I never had children of my own. Carol and I tried, for years, before medical realities made clear it wasn't going to happen for us, and by the time our marriage ended for reasons that had little to do with that particular disappointment, and everything to do with 2 people who'd simply grown into different lives, I'd made a kind of peace with not being a biological father to anyone. When I met Patricia, 14 years after the divorce, she came with 2 adult daughters, and, eventually, for grandchildren, and something in me that I hadn't fully realized was still hungry for that particular kind of connection found itself entirely, gratefully filled by the role of grandfather I got to step into, even without any blood tie attached to it. I want to be honest about something from the start, because it matters to everything that follows. I never once thought of my relationship with Patricia's grandchildren as somehow lesser because it lacked biology. I attended every school play, every soccer game I could reasonably access, every birthday party, for 19 years, with the same steady consistency I imagine a biological grandfather might bring, if he were the sort inclined toward actual presence rather than mere obligation. I built a treehouse in my backyard for Madison when she was 7, spent an entire summer teaching Tyler to fish at the lake house Patricia, and I bought specifically because it gave the grandchildren somewhere to look forward to visiting every year. I paid for braces for both of them when their own father, Patricia's first husband, proved unreliable about covering costs he'd agreed to in the divorce settlement. I was, by any measure except the strictly biological one, exactly what a grandfather is supposed to be. I remember, specifically, the day Tyler was born, sitting in a hospital waiting room alongside Diane's husband at the time, both of us equally useless in the particular way new grandfathers and new fathers are useless in a delivery ward, waiting for news. When the nurse finally came out and told us both, together, that everyone was healthy, I felt something in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel, given the technical fact that this child carried none of my own blood. It didn't matter. I held him for the first time later that evening, and something settled into place that never once required a biological explanation to feel completely real. The comment at the kitchen table happened on an ordinary Saturday morning, Tyler and Madison staying over while their mother, Patricia's younger daughter Diane, attended a work conference out of town. I'd made them breakfast, the same way I always did during their visits, and had stepped into the hallway to take a phone call from Patricia, who was at a doctor's appointment that morning. I came back within a few minutes, close enough to the kitchen doorway to hear the tail end of a conversation I hadn't been meant to overhear. Grandpa doesn't really count as family anymore, does he? Tyler said, in the particular tone of a 13-year-old testing out an observation he'd probably absorbed from somewhere else without fully examining where it came from. I mean, he's not even married to Grandma. He's just, like, the old guy who shows up sometimes. I should clarify something here, because it matters to understanding exactly how confused Tyler's statement actually was, beyond just being hurtful. Patricia and I had, in fact, been legally married for 19 years. Tyler's confusion, I later learned, stemmed from an offhand comment his father had made at some point, framing me as not real family, just Grandma's husband, a distinction his father seemed to find important to draw, likely for his own complicated reasons involving lingering resentment over how much more reliable and present I'd been in his children's lives than he himself had managed to be. Madison's response hurt in its own way, perhaps more than Tyler's original comment, because Madison was older old enough that I'd expected more thoughtfulness from her by that point. Yeah, he's basically just, like, Mom's stepdad's husband or whatever. It's kind of a weird relationship to even have a name for. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, feeling something in my chest go quietly, thoroughly still. 19 years of treehouses and fishing trips and braces and school plays, reduced, in the careless language of two teenagers who'd never once had to question whether I'd show up, to the old guy who shows up sometimes, and a weird relationship to even have a name for. I didn't confront them that morning. I want to explain why, because I think it matters to understanding the choice I eventually made. 13 and 15-year-olds say careless things constantly, testing observations, absorbing language from parents and friends without fully examining the weight of what they're repeating. Confronting them in that moment, angry and hurt as I genuinely was, would have accomplished little beyond making them defensive and making the rest of their visit uncomfortable. I finished making breakfast, sat down with them, and carried on the morning as though I hadn't heard anything at all. But I didn't forget it. I want to be honest about that too. Something in me, over the following weeks, began quietly reconsidering exactly what counting as family should actually mean, in the concrete, practical sense that eventually shows up in decisions rather than just in feelings. Patricia and I had, for years, maintained a simple estate plan, everything divided evenly among her 4 grandchildren upon both our deaths, structured through a family trust Patricia's own financial advisor had helped set up over a decade earlier. I'd never once questioned that arrangement, had in fact been the one who'd insisted, early in our marriage, that Patricia's grandchildren should be treated exactly as I'd have treated biological grandchildren of my own, without distinction, without hesitation. The kitchen table comment made me reconsider not whether Tyler and Madison deserved inclusion, but whether the specific structure of that inclusion still made sense given how casually they'd apparently come to regard the relationship itself. I didn't want to punish 2 teenagers for a careless comment born mostly from confusion about their own father's framing. But I did want to understand, more clearly, whether the relationship they described so dismissively reflected something real about how they actually experienced our connection, or whether it was simply careless language that didn't match their genuine feelings underneath. I decided, after considerable thought, on an approach that felt honest rather than punitive. I called a family meeting, of sorts, not confrontational, just an honest conversation, with Patricia present, with Diane present, and eventually, once the adults had talked through some groundwork, with Tyler and Madison themselves. Patricia's own reaction, when I first told her what I'd overheard, surprised me somewhat in its intensity. She'd cried, briefly, in our kitchen, apologizing on behalf of grandchildren who weren't even hers to apologize for in that particular way, and had wanted, in that first raw moment, to confront them immediately and forcefully. I talked her down from that instinct, gently, reminding her that anger delivered too quickly tends to produce defensiveness rather than reflection, and that if we wanted Tyler and Madison to actually examine their own carelessness rather than simply performing contrition to end an uncomfortable confrontation, we needed to give the conversation room to unfold more slowly than either of our wounded instincts initially wanted. I told them, calmly, exactly what I'd overheard that Saturday morning. I watched both their faces go through the particular horror of realizing an adult had heard something they'd assumed was private, followed by the more complicated horror of realizing the adult in question was someone who'd spent 19 years building treehouses and paying for braces and showing up, reliably, at every occasion that mattered. I'm not here to punish either of you for something you said without fully thinking it through, I told them. 13 and 15-year-olds say careless things. I understand that better than you might think. But I want to understand something honestly, and I need you to answer me as truthfully as you can. Do you actually believe I'm not real family? Not the careless version you said at the table, but the honest version, if you sat and actually thought about it. Tyler looked genuinely miserable, the particular misery of a young teenager confronting the actual weight of something he'd said thoughtlessly. No, I don't think that. I think I was just repeating something Dad said once, about you not being real family, and I didn't really think about what that actually meant when I said it. Your father said that? Patricia asked, her voice tight, and I could tell this detail genuinely surprised and hurt her in its own separate way. He said it kind of as a joke, I think, Tyler said, though his tone suggested he no longer fully believed his father's framing had been entirely joking. Like, that grandma's husband isn't really our grandpa the same way if we'd had a different family. Madison, to her credit, looked considerably more uncomfortable than Tyler, the particular discomfort of someone older who'd had less excuse for careless thoughtlessness. I don't actually think that either, Grandpa. I think I just agreed with Tyler because it was easier than thinking about it, and because sometimes it's just, like, easier to say the dismissive thing instead of the actual thing you feel. What's the actual thing you feel? I asked her directly. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice had lost its earlier careless flatness entirely. You taught me to fish. You've been at literally every single birthday I can remember having. When Dad forgot my 9th birthday completely, you drove 2 hours to bring me a cake because Mom mentioned it to you, even though it wasn't even your responsibility. I don't actually think you're not real family. I think I just don't always think carefully about what I'm actually saying, especially around Tyler, because we kind of feed off each other's careless comments without really meaning them. That admission, delivered with more genuine reflection than I'd expected from a 15-year-old caught in an uncomfortable conversation, told me something important, that the kitchen table comment had reflected careless language rather than genuine sentiment, but that the carelessness itself still mattered, still deserved to be named and addressed rather than simply absorbed silently the way I might have handled it 20 years earlier. I told them both, honestly, how the comment had affected me, not to guilt them further, but because I believed they deserved to understand the actual weight their words had carried, rather than assuming, as teenagers sometimes do, that careless comments simply evaporate once said. I told them about standing in that hallway, feeling 19 years of showing up reduced to the old guy who shows up sometimes. I watched both their faces absorb that, genuinely, in a way that suggested the lesson was landing considerably deeper than a simple scolding would have managed. What I didn't tell them, that day, was the decision I'd already begun making regarding the estate plan. I wanted their apology and their reflection to be genuine, uninfluenced by any awareness of financial consequences, rather than performed specifically because they suspected an inheritance might be at stake. I've since wondered whether that was entirely fair to them, denying them the full context while asking for full honesty, but I stand by the choice, because I wanted to understand their real feelings before any financial reality complicated the conversation. The letter arrived 6 weeks later, not because I decided to punish Tyler and Madison for the kitchen table comment itself, but because the entire episode had prompted me to have an overdue conversation with my own attorney about exactly how the estate should reflect the actual nature of my relationships, rather than a generic even split that had been established years earlier without much specific thought. I want to be clear about what the letter actually said, because I think the assumption most people make, hearing this story, is that I dramatically cut Tyler and Madison out of the estate in a fit of wounded pride. That's not what happened, and I think the actual outcome matters more than the dramatic version might suggest. The letter, drafted by my attorney Susan Marchetti, explained an updated trust structure that maintained equal distribution among all 4 of Patricia's grandchildren, exactly as it had always been, but that added, for the first time, individual letters to each grandchild, to be delivered along with their eventual inheritance, explaining specifically what their relationship with me had meant, concretely, in terms of years and events and effort, rather than leaving that history unspoken and vulnerable to exactly the kind of careless erasure Tyler and Madison had demonstrated at that kitchen table. For Tyler and Madison specifically, the letters included something more immediate, an invitation to a conversation, while I was still alive to have it, about what counting as family actually meant, structured not as a lecture, but as an honest accounting of 19 years neither of them had been old enough to fully witness or appreciate in real time. The letter that actually arrived at Diane's house, addressed formally through my attorney's office, was simply notification of the updated trust documents requiring signatures acknowledging receipt, standard legal procedure that happened to arrive during a period when the kitchen table comment was still fresh enough in everyone's memory that its timing felt, to Tyler and Madison, considerably more dramatic and consequential than the actual document itself. Diane called me, slightly alarmed, the day the letter arrived. Walter, the kids are asking whether this letter means something happened, whether you're upset with them still, about the comment. Madison's convinced you're cutting them out. I'm not cutting anyone out, I told her. The letter is just formal notification of updated trust language. Nothing about their actual inheritance has changed. But Diane, I do think it might be worth letting them sit with that fear for a day or two before I clarify, not out of cruelty, but because I think they need to understand, concretely, what genuine uncertainty about belonging actually feels like. The same uncertainty their careless comment suggested they'd already decided applied to me. Diane was quiet for a moment. That feels a little manipulative, Walter, I'll be honest. I considered that criticism carefully, because I respected Diane enough to take it seriously rather than dismissing it defensively. You might be right, I admitted. I'll call them myself, today, and clarify everything clearly. I don't actually want them anxious. I just wanted them to understand the weight of assuming a relationship is disposable before they'd had all the facts. I called Tyler and Madison together that evening, on speakerphone, and explained everything clearly. The trust remained equal. Nothing about their actual inheritance had changed, but I had added personal letters to be delivered alongside it, explaining, in my own words, exactly what our relationship had meant to me across 19 years, specifically so that whatever careless assumptions either of them might absorb from other sources in the future, they'd have something concrete and permanent. In writing, contradicting the idea that I'd ever been anything less than genuinely, fully their grandfather. I wasn't trying to scare you, I told them. I was trying to make sure that decades from now, long after I'm gone, if anyone ever suggests to either of you that I wasn't real family, you'll have something in your own hands proving otherwise, in my own words, rather than just a careless comment from someone who never bothered showing up the way I did. Madison cried on the phone, genuinely, the particular crying of someone confronting how close they'd come to permanently regretting words they hadn't fully meant. I'm sorry, Grandpa. I really am. I didn't think about how it would actually sound, hearing it back. Tyler, quieter, said something that stayed with me longer than Madison's more immediate emotional response. I think Dad says things like that because he feels guilty about not showing up as much as you do. I don't think I should have repeated it without thinking about what it actually meant, especially since you're the one who's always actually there. That observation, from a 13-year-old, showed more insight into his own father's likely motivations than I'd expected, and told me something hopeful about the eventual adult he might become, given room to keep examining his own careless assumptions rather than simply repeating them indefinitely. The months since have brought a noticeably different quality to my relationship with both grandchildren. Tyler asks me now, more directly, about things, why I chose to marry Patricia later in life, what it was like not having biological children, whether I ever resented not having my own grandchildren the traditional way. I've answered all of it honestly, including the honest truth that I stopped distinguishing my own from Patricia's grandchildren so thoroughly, so many years ago, that the question itself had genuinely stopped making sense to me long before that kitchen table comment forced the distinction back into conscious conversation. I had a conversation with Tyler's father, my stepdaughter's ex-husband, a few weeks after everything settled, mostly because I felt it was worth addressing the source of the original framing directly rather than simply correcting its effects on the children downstream. He was defensive at first, insisting he'd meant the comment as harmless joking, but eventually admitted, with more honesty than I'd expected from him, that some genuine guilt about his own inconsistent presence in his children's lives had probably found its way into an unfair dismissal of mine. I told him I didn't need an apology for my own sake, but that I hoped he'd consider, going forward, how his careless framing landed on children who were still working out what family actually meant. He said he would. I don't know whether he has. But the conversation itself felt worth having, regardless of how thoroughly he actually absorbs it. Madison started a tradition, this past spring, of calling me every other Sunday specifically to talk, not because anything was wrong, just to talk, the way she might call a biological grandfather she wanted to stay close to. I don't know whether that habit will last into her college years and beyond, the way habits sometimes fade once young people build lives of their own. But I've learned, across 19 years and one uncomfortable kitchen table conversation, that the habit of showing up consistently, even when it isn't dramatically acknowledged, eventually does get seen, sometimes only once the alternative, the fear of losing that consistency, becomes momentarily, uncomfortably real. Patricia and I renewed our vows last month, a small, quiet ceremony in our backyard, near the treehouse I'd built for Madison all those years earlier. Tyler and Madison both stood with us, Tyler holding the rings, Madison reading a short passage Patricia had chosen. Afterward, Madison hugged me and said, quietly, "I know this doesn't need saying anymore, but you're my actual grandpa. Not the weird relationship without a name. Just my grandpa." I've turned that sentence over many times since, understanding it as the actual resolution of a comment that had once, briefly, made me question whether 19 years of showing up had been seen at all. If someone in your life has ever made you feel like your role wasn't quite real, quite permanent, quite worth the specific name it deserves, I hope you find a way to make the truth concrete, in whatever form makes sense for your own family, rather than simply absorbing the careless comment and letting it stand unchallenged. Concrete doesn't have to mean legal documents or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it simply means saying, plainly and without embarrassment, exactly what a relationship has meant to you, in specific detail, rather than trusting that years of quiet consistency will automatically speak for themselves without ever being named out loud. And if this story reminded you of a grandparent, a step-parent, or any family member whose consistent presence has gone under-acknowledged by people too young or too careless to recognize its full weight yet, tell them plainly what their showing up has actually meant. Some relationships don't need a biological label to be entirely, permanently real.